Well, chaps, here we are. Bear with us on this one. For a little while now, I have been interested in the English Civil War because, like the American Civil War later, most civil wars, it's fascinating that when somebody, a country turns itself in upon one another, and our Civil War, and technically we had three between 1642 and 1651, was one of the bloodiest, probably the bloodiest event to have happened on English soil since the days of the Roman Empire, if not worse, the Empire, and anything that happened before it, indeed. It was the last time in England, anyway, because there were battles in Scotland, of course, a century later, that there were major battles in on English soil, all over the place, really, not just around, very little happened around London in a way, and the likes of Naseby, Marston Moor, Edgehill happened north and far north, Yorkshire, for instance. There was the siege of Portsmouth, obviously on the south coast, which was the Roundheads, the parliamentarians besieging a royalist stronghold that eventually was surrendered with only a handful of men that you could count on both hands, probably. Aylesbury is a town that is not known for anything particular in the Civil War, despite the subject of this video. So as I say, bear with us, because of whatever reason, despite its proximity to London, and the fact that it had a famous person connected with it, John Hampden, who, as I said in a separate video, has a statue in town, and his statue is used on anything for the council, what is now known as Buckinghamshire Council, and Aylesbury Fell District Council. There's a lot of things named for him, even though he was MP for Buckingham, a few miles to the north of us, and died sort of west of us, out towards town, well, village slash town Tame, closer to Oxford than it is Aylesbury. Now it's in 1643. So I'm looking around and I'm thinking, in lockdown I was reading a bit about the Civil War. Charles Spencer's books about Charles the First and Second are quite interesting. I think the first one's To Kill a King, and the second is To Catch a King. I won't give you any guesses which one's about what thing, but I was googling, and then it says Battle of Aylesbury in 1642, and I thought, bloody hell, battle. And there's a picture of a church with like a cask or some kind of burial device, and it says it's got all these bones in it, and and so I was saying to my mum about it, and she drove us up there because she's got a car and I don't drive. A place called Hardwick, which is a typical English village. Houses are very expensive from what I could see. I didn't see any signs up, but they looked like, this is what you put. It's the kind of place that a member of Parliament might actually buy a house in to get away from there, or be near Chequers. Anyway, the church is St Mary's Church, one of thousands probably named after St Mary, and it's like, as you'll see in the pictures, it has this plaque on the side that if you look at the picture, it goes on for a while, but basically says that there are the bones of at least 247 men believed to have died at the Battle of Aylesbury at Holman's Bridge, and the end of it is what a nice man says, let's hope basically that we don't have to fight one another again. It was bad enough doing it the first time. Excuse me. So you think, well, okay, big deal. Civil War was quite bad, and the sources are a bit sketchy. Now with the battle, apparently Prince Rupert had legend in his own mind in some respects. The cousin of Charles II, who, as he was, but of course that means he's the nephew of Charles I, led troops out from Aylesbury, having just taken it apparently, and engaged the enemy at a ford at Holman's Bridge. And despite the fact he had 2,000 men to the parliamentarians' 1,500, they nonetheless routed him, and all those men, quite a few hundred men died. Wasn't the bloodiest battle, but for Aylesbury, pretty big deal probably. I don't even think the Romans, if they were did much around Aylesbury, did that kind of thing, and the Anglo-Saxons probably not. The worst probably would be the Black Death, I suppose. Anyway, and ultimately, of course, Parliament wins the Civil War. Charles I escapes a couple of times. He ultimately held at Hurst Castle after his last attempt on the south coast near Milford on sea, just west of Southampton, and across the water from Yarmouth on the Isle of Wight. And then, of course, he gets taken to London and is executed on the 30th of January 1649. The only time before and since that a member of that a king has been executed, certainly by Parliament. We've had King, indeed Charles is notable for many reasons, but for the fact that I believe, unless I look, the last monarch, the last monarch really to be killed as such. William II, of course, was killed by accident or on purpose. There's still a debate in 1097, and a few other king, Richard III was killed at Bosworth. Kings have been assassinated or poisoned. It happened, and after Charles I, things sort of settled. I think George II was the last monarch to lead his troops in battle. So you think, a big deal, Battle of Aylesbury. But the trouble is, apparently, there's absolute doubt that this battle even happened. For instance, Prince Rupert apparently was in Abingdon, west of us, in the suburbs of Oxford, or east of Oxford. Nowhere near Aylesbury, or indeed Thame, where he retreated to. The parliamentarians were all over the place. The bones could even be those of Anglo-Saxons from what would now be just over 1,000 years ago. It's typical that anything associated with this town is not entirely solid or reliable. It's a romantic image. Those who say that the battle never happened, and they outnumber those who say it did, believed that right from the 1640s this was a piece of both royalist and parliamentary propaganda. It was blowing up to say, on one hand, this is what the royalists are like, and this is what the Roundheads are like, the barbarians, and Prince Rupert was a legend, really. He's been he's not always favourably looked at, but he was, in spite of his impetuous nature, in battle, he was a very good fighter. And again, I marvel that there was a time once in this country's history that the monarchy had a very firm hand on things like battles. And I read recently, and I think it's Antonio Fraser's book about Charles II, that after the Restoration, of course, the king had to take charge during the plague of 1665, and then his brother James, the future James II, and Prince Rupert had to take over the firefighting because Lord Mayor was utterly useless, and were visibly seen. The king was literally throwing coins at firefighters to keep them, because in those days we were going for a fire brigade. I think the first London fire brigade only came along almost a century and a half after the fire. And then there's the battles with the Dutch. James was commanding the ship, Prince Rupert. So there was you wouldn't get that now. The Queen, God bless her, would not be taking charge. There's a fire as I speak going on in Elephant Castle. That looks pretty bad. It's not going to be a great fire unless something really bad goes on. But you're not going to get her or Prince Charles or Princess Anne or Andrew taking charge. So the Battle of Aylesbury is interesting in that I think there's a road nowadays to the north of the town named after him. Indeed, the estate, Buckingham Park Estate, has a lot of names from the Civil War era on either side from the looks of it. Not Cromwell, I saw. The Civil War pitched family against family. It was said that if there was more than one son in a family, which often there were, because families in those days were fairly big for the sake of survival, I suppose, one reason why monarchy in those days had to have children, because they're trying to keep the line going. But, one son would be for the parliamentarians, one son would be for the royalists, purely so that when the war ended one way or the other, one could say they had been right all along. And London could have been taken by Charles earlier on, and there's a thousand more things, but the little old Aylesbury in those days must have been fairly insignificant. I mean, as I said, this battle happened at a place called Holman's Bridge, where there's little, if anything. And these bones were found about 150, 170 years after the fact. Nothing really has been found to suggest the battle happened archaeology by excavations. I can never say archaeology when I want to. No flints, flintlocks, no weapon, clothing. Well, you're not going to get clothing necessarily, I suppose. Helmets or anything as a battle involving hundreds of men would perhaps do. As far as I know, the bones have never been tested since they were interred at St Mary's. There's no one around here with a Channel 4 documentary team to forensically analyse the bones and date them. So it's a touching little thing, meaning that even Aylesbury was involved in this great battle. Since then, Aylesbury, not really a town known for things that are impressive. Well, they're impressive for the wrong reasons, I suppose. Men did die in both wars and the Falklands from this town, but it's largely a farming community. Churchill's daughter Mary Soames ended up writing in her biography 10 years ago that she knew Aylesbury because she was based at St Mandeville Hospital. In those days, hospital was much more out of the way than it is now. Nowadays, it's very firmly it feels part of the town. Physically, there's house and estates and whatnot between there and the town centre. The hospital largely was born out of a place to treat Canadian pilots burned in the Battle of Britain, and indeed it's still largely well known for its burns unit, but sadly it's also nowadays known as one of the many places Jimmy Savile had a connection with, for instance. The town also in the 60s was where the great train robbers were tried because they committed their deed up not too far from the town in the countryside. Jermaine Lindsay, the King's Cross / Russell Square July 7 bombers on Aylesbury, and his missus was Samantha Louvre, who's known as the White Widow, and apparently is a strategic genius for Al-Qaeda / ISIS, although there are doubts in the town. He did go to the Grange. Not that means any difference. I went to Mandeville and that didn't exactly have a good reputation. But and it's known for a duck, which is rather a nice eat, if you fancy it. So that's the Battle of Aylesbury, for good or for ill. If you have made it this far, thank you, and tell your friends if they want to giggle.